Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. 14 months may seem like a short time, but in Vietnam, every minute lasted an eternity. John Parker is my name, and after decades of keeping these memories, I realized that some stories need to be told not for the glory, but for the truth they carry. I was a young man of 22 when I landed in Da Nang with the 25th Infantry Division. The humid, heavy air of the Vietnamese jungle hit me like a punch in the stomach. Nothing in the training at Fort Benning could have prepared me for what was to come. Our unit consisted of 40 men, all as young and inexperienced as I was. Sergeant Martinez, a veteran of Guerrilla, was our only anchor of real combat experience. He used to say that in the jungle, it wasn't the enemy that killed you first, it was fear. The first week was dedicated to reconnaissance patrols near the base. The constant sound of Huey helicopters flying over the area mixed with the noises of the jungle, creating a disturbing symphony that never left our ears. We carried our M16 as if it were part of our body, slept with it, ate with it within reach. It was during our third week that we had our first real contact with the Viet Cong. We were patrolling an area near a small village when the silence was broken by gunfire coming from the trees. Young Wilson, who was standing next to me, fell instantly. There were no screams, just a deafening thud as his body hit the muddy ground. Sergeant Martinez reacted instantly, ordering us to spread out and seek cover. Firing came from all directions, a classic guerrilla tactic to confuse the enemy. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and a deafening sound of gunfire. I learned that day that there is nothing glorious about real combat. It's confusing, chaotic, and terrifying. You don't think, you just react. Your training takes over and you move on instinct. We managed to repel the attack, but we lost 3 men that day. Wilson was the first of many who would fall. The nights in the jungle were the worst. The darkness was absolute, and every noise could mean an imminent attack. We developed a sixth sense to detect suspicious movements, but the constant fear took its toll. Some men began to show signs of extreme fatigue. Others developed a blank stare that denounced the psychological weight they were carrying. The Viet Cong was an invisible enemy, always present but rarely seen. They knew the jungle like the back of their hands, using underground tunnels to appear and disappear like ghosts. Their traps were ingenious and lethal. We lost Corporal Henderson to one of these traps, an experience that still haunts me in my nightmares. The rain became our constant companion. It soaked our boots, our clothes, our equipment. Fungus grew on everything, including our skin, but we learned to use the rain to our advantage, taking advantage of the noise to mask our movements during night operations. Sergeant Martinez taught us how to survive. Stick together, he would say, trust each other. He was right. The unity between the men was our only defense against the madness that surrounded us. We shared food, cigarettes, stories from home. Each story was a small anchor of sanity amidst the chaos. I learned to sleep standing up, to eat whatever was available, to treat wounds with minimal resources. But above all, I learned about human nature in its rawest forms. I saw men display extraordinary courage and others succumb to the weight of fear. There were no judgments, only understanding. Each of us was fighting our own inner battle. The months dragged on, and each day seemed like an eternity. Letters from home were our only connection to the normal world we had left behind. Some news was devastating. Girlfriends who didn't wait, family members who left, dreams that fell apart. Others brought hope and the strength to carry on. Our main mission was to protect local villages from Viet Cong attacks, but the line between friend and foe was often blurred. During the day, the villagers welcomed us with cautious smiles. At night, some of them could well be wielding weapons against us. It was a war of shadows and mistrust. These memories are still vivid in my mind, as if they happened yesterday. The smell of the jungle after the rain, the sound of the helicopters, the faces of the comrades we lost. Everything remains crystallized in time. These are memories that I carry not as medals of honor, but as scars that have shaped who I have become. Every day in the Vietnamese jungle, we learned a new lesson about survival. Sergeant Martinez taught us that the sound of a twig breaking could mean the difference between life and death. One night in particular remains vivid in my memory, when our unit was ordered to investigate suspicious activity near a village called Mloc. It was a seemingly simple reconnaissance mission, but in the Vietnam War, nothing was simple. Our 12-man team moved silently through the dense vegetation, every step calculated, every breath controlled. Corporal Stevens, a boy from Kansas who had barely turned 19, followed ahead of me, his eyes constantly scanning the canopy of trees. Martinez had warned us about the Viet Some's underground traps, known as devil holes. These were camouflage pits with sharp bamboo stakes at the bottom, often poisoned. We lost good men to these primitive but lethal traps. That night, our eyes were both on the ground and in the treetops. The silence was broken by the distant sound of voices. Martinez signaled for us to crouch, and we saw movement through the vegetation. It was a group of Viet Some, about 20 men, carrying supplies. We were outnumbered, but we had the element of surprise in our favor. The plan was simple: observe their movement and report back to base. But plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy. One of our own, young Franklin, stepped on a dry branch. The snap sounded deafening in the stillness of the night. In a matter of seconds, all hell broke loose. The first shots came from our direction. Martinez had given the order to open fire as soon as our position was compromised. The air was filled with the sound of M16s and AK-47s. In the darkness, the flashes of gunfire were like lightning, briefly illuminating tense, determined faces. I threw myself behind a thick tree, feeling splinters of wood flying as the bullets hit my cover. Stevens managed to establish an effective firing position and began providing suppressive fire, allowing part of our team to reposition. Martinez's experience once again proved to be our salvation. He coordinated our response with precise hand signals, preventing the enemy from flanking us. The fight lasted about 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The acrid smell of burning gunpowder mixed with the metallic odor of blood and the suffocating scent of decaying vegetation. When the shooting finally stopped, we had lost 2 men. Franklin didn't survive the night, and Morris was shot in the chest while trying to drag a wounded companion to cover. The enemy suffered higher casualties, but as always, disappeared into the jungle like smoke. During the retreat, carrying our dead and wounded, Martinez shared a painful truth. In war, sometimes victory tastes like defeat. Those words echoed in my mind as I helped carry Franklin's body back to base. The following days were marked by even greater tension. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every bush could hide a trap. We developed a sixth sense for danger, an intuition born of constant fear and the need to survive. The war changed us all. I saw tough men cry at night when they thought no one was looking. I saw idealistic young men turn into hardened veterans in a matter of weeks. Fear was our constant companion, but we learned to use it as a tool for survival. One of the hardest lessons was accepting that we couldn't save everyone. Each casualty was like losing a brother, but we couldn't afford to stop and mourn. The war continued, relentless and indifferent to our losses. Martinez began to train us in more advanced night combat techniques. We learned to move like shadows, to read the terrain even in the deepest darkness. The night could be your best friend or your worst enemy, he would say. It depends on how you use it. The letters from home became even more precious. Every word was a reminder of the normal world we had left behind, an anchor of sanity in the midst of chaos. Some men stopped opening their letters, fearing bad news that might shake their resolve. Others read them until the pages fell apart. The jumble continued to be our prison and our protector, a green labyrinth where every day was a new battle for survival. But we were learning, adapting, becoming the kind of soldiers this war demanded. The price of this transformation was high, but we had no choice but to pay it. The deaths of Franklin and Morris made us more cautious, but also more determined. Sergeant Martinez intensified our training, insisting that we needed to become even more lethal and silent than the enemy. "You need to think like them," he would constantly say, anticipate their moves before they happen. One of the tactics we developed was what we called a ghost patrol. We moved only during the darkest hours of the night. Using the new moon as our ally, we learned to communicate through silent signals developed specifically for our unit. A tap on the shoulder, a specific hand movement, each gesture had a meaning that could save our lives. On one of these patrols, we discovered something that would change our perspective on the enemy. We came across a complex of Viet Cong tunnels, a veritable underground city. The system was impressive. They had makeshift hospitals, ammunition dumps, even rest areas. Martinez decided we needed to explore, even knowing the risks. Our tunnel team consisted of 5 men: me, Martinez, Stevens, Anderson, and Carter. We were the smallest of the group, able to squeeze through the narrow underground corridors. We called ourselves Tunnel Rats, a title we carried with grim pride. The air down there was stifling, a mixture of damp earth and mold. Our flashlights created dancing shadows on the earthen walls, and every sound echoed disturbingly. Anderson, who was claustrophobic, had to mentally recite his brother's names to keep calm. It was during one of these underground missions that we had our closest encounter with the enemy. We were mapping a new sector when we heard voices approaching. There was nowhere to run. The tunnel was too narrow. Martinez signaled us to turn off the flashlights and press ourselves against the walls. The Viet Cong soldiers passed so close that I could feel the fabric of their clothes rubbing against my leg. Those were the longest moments of my life. A sneeze, an involuntary movement, anything could give us away. I held my breath until my lungs burned. After they passed, we waited another 10 minutes before moving. Martinez always said that patience was our best weapon. That day he was right. We found important documents in that tunnel, maps that revealed the enemy's strategic positions. But the underground war was taking its toll. Carter started having terrible nightmares, waking up screaming about being buried alive. Stevens developed a chronic cough due to the stale air in the tunnels. Still, we kept going down because every piece of information we collected could save lives. The experience in the tunnels changed our understanding of the conflict. We saw that we were fighting a determined and resourceful enemy who had turned their technological disadvantage into a strategic advantage. They had made the land their ally, while we were still struggling to adapt to the terrain. Martinez taught us to respect the enemy without fearing him. Knowing your opponent is the first step to defeating them, he used to say. We began to study their patterns, their tactics, their way of thinking. Each mission made us more efficient, more adapted to the war we were fighting. The nights became our domain. We learned to move like shadows, to read the terrain with our feet, to sense the enemy's presence before we even saw him. The fear was still there, but now was controlled, channeled into a constant state of alert that kept our senses sharp. The jungle no longer seemed as hostile as before. We had learned its secrets, its sounds, its dangers. Each tree could be both a protection and a threat, depending on how we used it. The rain, which used to be our enemy, became our ally in concealing our movements. During this period, we lost contact with other units for weeks. We were operating deep in enemy territory, where radio communications were very risky. We depended solely on each other and the skills we had developed to survive. The experience in the tunnels had taught us a brutal truth. Adaptation was the key to survival. But nothing prepared us for the mission we received in mid-July. Our unit was assigned to a search and rescue operation 30 kilometers north of our position, in territory heavily controlled by the Viet Cong. A reconnaissance team had gone missing during a routine mission. Their radio emitted one last fragmented transmission before total silence. Martinez gathered the team together and presented the situation to us bluntly. This mission is voluntary. I'm not ordering anyone to go. We all stepped forward. At that moment, I realized that we were no longer just soldiers following orders. We were brothers willing to risk everything for each other. Stevens, still fighting his cough from the tunnels, insisted on taking part. I'm not going to let you enjoy yourselves alone, he said, trying to disguise his concern with humor. We moved for 3 days through the densest jungle we had ever faced. The vegetation was so thick that we could barely see 3 meters in front of us. The heat was stifling, and the mosquitoes were relentless. Anderson developed a fever, but refused to go back. On the morning of the fourth day, we found the first signs of the missing team. Pieces of equipment scattered around, scuff marks on the ground. Martinez examined the area with experienced eyes. "That was an ambush," he muttered, "well planned." We followed the trail to a clearing where we found evidence of an intense firefight. Empty cartridges, dried blood stains, destroyed equipment. Carter discovered a diary belonging to one of the missing soldiers. The last notes reported suspicious movements in the area. The silence of the jungle was broken by the distant sound of gunfire. Martinez signaled for us to split into two teams. I led one group with Stevens and Anderson, while Martinez followed with Carter and Thompson in the other direction. The idea was to flank the possible enemy position. We moved like ghosts among the trees, each step calculated to avoid any noise. The intensive training of the last few months had turned us into silent predators. Stevens, despite his condition, moved with the grace of a panther. The sound of gunfire became closer, and then we heard screams. They weren't screams of combat, but of pain. We moved faster, remaining as cautious as possible. That's when we spotted a small wooden structure, partially hidden by vegetation. Through a broken window, I saw movement inside. I signaled for Stevens and Anderson to get into position. Before we could act, Martinez and his team emerged from the other side of the structure. He had come to the same conclusion as us. The attack was swift and precise. Years later, I'm still impressed by the efficiency of that operation. There was no hesitation, no mistakes. We found 3 members of the missing team still alive, albeit in critical condition. They'd been tortured for information. The rescue was just the beginning. The real challenge would be to get them back through hostile territory. We improvised stretchers with branches and equipment. Anderson, still fighting his fever, insisted on helping to carry one of the wounded. The way back was a logistical nightmare. Every move had to be planned, every stop strategically chosen. The enemy certainly knew of our presence and was hunting us down. At night, we could hear movement around us, but Martinez had positioned us so well that we were practically invisible. It was during this retreat that Stevens proved his true worth. Even with his respiratory condition, he offered to stay at the rear, protecting our retreat. "Someone needs to make sure you don't get lost," he joked, but his eyes revealed the seriousness of his decision. Exhaustion began to take its toll. The men we were carrying needed urgent medical attention, and our supplies were running low. Martinez held the group together through sheer force of will. "Every step takes us closer to home," he repeated, a mantra that kept us going. On the last night before we reached our base, we came under attack. The enemy had caught up with us and attempted one last assault to recover the prisoners. It was one of the fiercest battles I've ever faced. Anderson, even though he was ill, fought like a demon. Stevens, with his persistent cough, maintained a firing line that saved our lives several times. When we finally arrived at the base, carrying our rescued comrades and our own wounds, something had changed in us. We were no longer just survivors. We were warriors who had looked death in the eye and refused its invitation. Martinez gathered us together that night and said something I've never forgotten. "True strength lies not in how much you can take, but in how much you are willing to sacrifice for others." The rescue mission had cost us more than just physical strength. Anderson never fully recovered from his fever, and Stevens' cough worsened considerably. But the real price we paid was psychological. The images of the tortured soldiers we rescued were etched into our minds like permanent scars. Martinez noticed the change in our unit. We had a different, more hardened look. We were no longer the same young men who had landed in Da Nang months ago. The war had transformed us into something we didn't always recognize in a mirror. Our next mission came 2 weeks later. Intelligence indicated that the Viet Cong were planning a massive attack on several villages in the region. Our task was to intercept a convoy of supplies that would fuel this attack. It sounded simple on paper, but in the Vietnam War, nothing was simple. Carter and I were assigned to advance reconnaissance. We spent 3 days observing enemy movements, documenting routes and schedules. During these observations, we witnessed something that would change our perspective on the conflict. We saw entire families, including children, being forced to transport supplies to the Viet Cong. "We can't just attack," I whispered to Carter as we watched. "There would be too many civilian casualties." He nodded, his face revealing the same moral dilemma I felt. When we reported the situation to Martinez, he was silent for a long time. The decision we made that night would haunt many of us for years to come. Martinez developed a plan to intercept the convoy at a specific point, where civilians were usually dismissed. It was risky, it required perfect timing, and left no room for error. Stevens, even with his condition deteriorating, insisted on taking part. "You need someone to cover the southern flank," he said between coughing fits. Anderson, still recovering, also volunteered. The loyalty of these men was something that transcended military duty. On the night of the operation, a fine rain began to fall, creating a natural curtain that concealed our movements. We positioned ourselves along the planned route, each man knowing exactly his role. The plan depended on precise coordination and silent communication. The convoy appeared punctually, moving like a dark snake through the vegetation. We waited patiently until the civilians were dismissed, our fingers tense on the triggers, hearts hammering against our ribs. Martinez gave the signal, and all hell broke loose. The operation was a tactical success, but the cost was high. Stevens, covering our retreat, was hit in the shoulder. Anderson managed to drag him to safety, but the wound quickly became infected in the humid jungle environment. We lost 3 precious days trying to stabilize him before getting medical evacuation. During those days, Martinez kept us together through his silent leadership. He understood that every decision in combat carried a moral weight that went beyond the simple question of living or dying. "In war," he said one night, "sometimes the right decisions hurt the most." The loss of Stevens to medical evacuation deeply affected the morale of the unit. He had become more than a comrade. He was a symbol of our resistance, fighting through his illness with unwavering determination. Carter began to have frequent nightmares, waking up screaming names we didn't recognize. The following weeks were marked by a series of small operations, each one testing our adaptability and resolve. We learned to operate with fewer men, to trust each other even more. Martinez taught us that in a reduced unit, each man needed to be able to perform multiple functions. The war had become our new normal, a bizarre routine of patrols, ambushes, and moments of unbearable tension interspersed with periods of crushing boredom. The letters from home seemed to come from another world, speaking of a reality we could no longer fully comprehend. One night, during a particularly tense patrol, Anderson shared something that resonated with all of us. "You know what's scariest? It's not combat, it's not death. It's realizing that we've gotten used to it all." Those words perfectly captured the transformation we had undergone. Martinez, in his wisdom, constantly reminded us of our humanity. "Keep something sacred," he would say, "something that war can't touch." For some it was a family photo, for others a prayer or a private ritual. They were small anchors of sanity in a world that had lost its meaning. The war changed all of us in ways we couldn't always understand. After Stevens returned from medical evacuation, our unit underwent a silent transformation. He came back different, quieter, but with an even stronger determination. His near-death experience had given him a perspective that he shared with us in whispers during the long nights of vigil. Martinez realized that we needed a mission to reconnect us as a unit. The opportunity came with orders to protect a series of villages that were being systematically attacked. It was a mission that required more than just military skill. It demanded an understanding of the human terrain we had learned to navigate. Anderson, still struggling with the remnants of his fever, became our expert in communicating with the locals. His calm, impatient manner broke down barriers that guns could never cross. Through him, we began to better understand the complexity of the conflict we were fighting. One night, during a patrol, we came across a village that had just been attacked. The scene was devastating, but it was our reaction that surprised me. There was no longer that paralyzing horror of the first few days. In its place was a cold, professional determination. Martinez watched us with a look that mixed pride and concern. "You have become the soldiers you needed to be." he said as we organized the defense of the village. But never forget the cost of that transformation. His words carried the weight of months of shared experience, of losses and victories that had forged our unity. Carter, who used to have frequent nightmares, developed an almost supernatural calm in combat situations. He explained one night, "It's not that the fear is gone. I've learned to use it as fuel." That was a lesson we all somehow internalized. Our last major operation began with information about a planned massive Viet-Cong attack. Intelligence indicated that several enemy units were concentrating nearby. Martinez assembled the team, and, for the first time, I saw concern in his experienced eyes. Stevens, despite his not yet fully recovered condition, was the first to volunteer for the reconnaissance mission. "Some ghosts need to be faced," he said, and we all understood that he wasn't just talking about the mission. For 3 days, we operated on the edge between life and death. Every move was calculated. Every decision could mean the success or failure of the mission. Anderson established a network of informants in the local villages, while Carter and I mapped out the enemy infiltration routes. The final confrontation was inevitable. When it came, I was prepared for the chaos of combat, but not for the silence that preceded it. It was a moment of crystal clarity, where every man in the unit knew exactly his role. We didn't need words. Months of combat together had turned us into a finely tuned machine. Martinez led the counterattack with the precision of a surgeon. Our positions were set up to maximize the element of surprise, using all the knowledge we had accumulated about the terrain and the enemy's tactics. It was our last dance with death in the Vietnamese jungle. The success of the operation came with a price. Anderson was seriously wounded protecting a group of civilians. As we carried him to the evacuation, he smiled faintly and said, "At least this time we know what we're fighting for." His words echoed in our minds in the days that followed. The final weeks of our mission were marked by a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. We knew we were about to leave the jungle, but we also knew that part of us would remain there forever. Martinez gathered the unit together one last time before our departure. "You now carry something that few can understand," he said. "It's not just the combat stories or the scars. It's a deep understanding of what it means to be human in the most inhuman of times." In leaving Vietnam, each of us took different lessons with us. Stevens learned about resilience, Anderson about compassion, Carter about silent courage. I learned that war isn't about victories or defeats. It's about the people who fight alongside you and the reasons why you choose to keep fighting. Today, decades later, I still meet some of the survivors of the unit. We meet occasionally, sharing stories that only we can fully understand. The bond forged in the Vietnamese jungle remains strong, a brotherhood sealed with sacrifice and determination. Martinez taught us more than combat tactics. He showed us how to maintain our humanity in circumstances that threatened to rob it from us. His legacy lives on in the lessons we pass on, the stories we tell, and the way we choose to honor the memory of those who didn't come back. The Vietnam War may have ended a long time ago, but its lessons continue to reverberate in our lives. Each of us carries invisible scars, memories that cannot be erased, but which have made us who we are today. And perhaps that is the true essence of war, not the battles we fight, but the people we become by fighting.